Thank you, everyone. And I will ask my panelists to join me here on stage as I give an introduction to the folks that are coming on stage as we come down. So in our panel today, we have Philip Ammon, who's the Senior Community Manager at Bosch, who's currently, Philip chairs the Technical Steering Committee for the Linux Foundation project on enabling Linux and safety applications, and is also an inaugural member of the Advisory Board of Linux Foundation Europe. So welcome, Philip. We have Keith Burgelt, who is the CEO of the Open Innovation Network, which is the organisation that mitigates patent risk in open source with over 4,000 community members. We have Sarah Gallion, who leads the Software-Defined Vehicle Working Group on behalf of the Eclipse Foundation. And we have Frank Karliczek, who's the CEO of Nextcloud, the open source content collaboration platform, and also a long-time open source contributor and privacy activist. So everyone here today is bringing a unique perspective on competitiveness and what it means for them personally and for Europe as a whole. So we actually did a prep session, but then we discussed this over lunchtime and said some of the points that we have just talked about have already been covered in today's session. So I'm going to start by asking the panelists a little bit about their thoughts about competitiveness, where they think we stand, its relationship to open source, and indeed some of the discussion that has already happened today. So Sarah, maybe I'll start with you. What are your thoughts in terms of how open source relates to competitiveness?
Yeah, so thanks, Claire, for the introduction, first of all, and thanks for the question. So I think there's been quite a lot of talk today about open source and its relationship to innovation, with the idea of moving away from this mania of innovating at all costs and maybe focusing more on maintenance. And this is where I think that open source and competitiveness really plays a role, because on one hand, open source allows you to share the burden of innovation, even though this is probably not cool anymore, but open source allows you to share the burden so that you can risk more, you can try more things. On one hand, because you work mostly on non-competitive pieces of software. Some of them are customer-facing. In the automotive domain, mostly they are not customer-facing, what is non-differentiating. So you do share the burden of innovation even below the value line, and you are able to speed up your process so that you can really focus then later on the development of the customer-facing features. So open source in this case is a way of sharing the risk close to innovation. Innovation can happen below the value line, and then it speeds up, it allows you to develop faster applications that are customer-facing in the automotive domain, and this is where you make money.
Thank you very much, and it's a very important point. I loved the point that was made earlier about the innovation fetish that we all have, but it's not always shiny and new, and innovation can happen in many places, and I suppose in many ways. And I know, Philip, we were talking about that, so perhaps you can elaborate on how you're thinking about innovation in that respect.
Yeah, I also will deviate a little bit of what I originally prepared and thought about this field. And just taking the competitive part of open source. So what we see is we get new players. So we get a competition within the automotive field, and it's coming from different regions. And what we see, the competitiveness is increasing by open source. So actually open source enables competitiveness for new players, right? Because they don't develop according to traditional standards, which we have in automotive. They go new ways, and they bring in or you can say innovative ideas. And if you take this from the past, like I had a discussion yesterday before, a lot of innovation came from open source, like version controls, CI/CD practices, and so on. It's you, as being in an open source project, you need to be effective and efficient in what you're doing, and you need to have control. And so on. A lot of these practices which came in, which feel like standardization is driving the speed of open source, and that's what other small companies, new players identify, and how they be competitive with traditional automotive OEMs, tiers, and so on.
No, thank you. And again, another speaker earlier on today, you know, they mentioned the fact that open source definitely favors the challengers, favors the folks that are actually trying to compete, perhaps the underdog. So in a scenario where we may have had conversations about how Europe as a whole may have missed opportunities in the past, there is another opportunity now that we can disrupt using open source. So yeah, thank you for that. Now, Frank, I'm going to come to you next. We had an interesting conversation over lunch, and I think, can you maybe comment a little bit about, again, your thoughts on competitiveness, but also what you have learned so far in the conference?
Yeah, I really have to say that I'm frustrated at the moment because we have some unique challenges here in Europe. We have like Trump, of course, a huge challenge. We have the situation with Russia, the situation with China. And so I think in Europe we really have the need to act like really fast. Like the next few months we really need to put us into a very competitive position where we can actually fight for our rights, our freedoms, our human values, everything we have here in Europe. And I attend quite some events like this one, and I think we always tell each other, yes, let's do something. But I don't see a lot of action, I have to say. There's a lot of like, yeah, open source is great, innovation is great, let's do something, but the action is really missing, and this is the frustrating part on my side.
What do you think we should do?
Well, for example, there is this narrative that, well, we cannot really deliver in Europe, we need the hyperscalers, there is not a lot of tech here, there's not a lot of innovation there, and this is totally not true. I had a discussion like earlier this morning where some people said, yeah, we need to buy from the hyperscalers because there's nothing in Europe, and that's totally not true, it's just false marketing.
Well, it's marketing, and that's something that I think maybe the big players have that are maybe more than the open source ecosystem. So, I mean, again, one of the observations I would have when we were talking about competitiveness is that many of the large organizations that have proprietary solutions that open source vendors are competing against, oftentimes they spend a good whack on building great technology, but they spend an equally big whack on marketing those technologies. And I wonder, in the context of the open source ecosystem, if we spend as much or time now, or money, in terms of actually the narrative communicating the value, because we've had a lot of discussions earlier as well about the value of open source. But it seems like this conversation happens a lot within the open source community, but how much of it happens outside the open source community, or even globally in terms of Europe's position. So Keith, I'm going to come to you now because you obviously are running a global organization, and the Open Invention Network or this Innovation Network are actually looking at this from a global perspective. So when you look at that, how do you think Europe shows up on that global stage? And how are we messaging the competitiveness of European solutions in that respect? Do you see that being a thing?
I think we have a problem globally with understanding what is innovation. I think we have all manner of ways of evaluating content. One of the contents is patents, and it's very often there's a tie and a link that shouldn't be made, that is made between patenting and innovation. Patenting is an indication of the codification of ideas, but open source is so much more than what the patent system is really about and what it can accommodate and deliver. This is a social movement, and I think we always, first and foremost, need to remind ourselves of this because the power comes in the modality of open source. It happens to produce technology, but the idea of collaborative development, which is so central to open source, is what I focus on and what when I build community by getting people to agree that where we collaborate, we should not be suing each other. We should compete more effectively through cooperation. And all the ideas around innovation that kind of came up in the 90s during the heyday before before 99. These ideas actually are no more present than they are in open source. Open source is allowing us to realize a vision of how we bring the outside in, how we create collaboration and cross-fertilization of ideas, how we discourage the notion that people have to relocate to places like Route 128 in Boston or Silicon Valley or Sophia Antipolis or anywhere else that's a mecca that's established as a mecca for innovation. Innovation is happening all around us, and I don't know that we need to beat the drum about how open source is so powerful and so meaningful. I think we just need to live it. We need to embrace it. And we need to recognize how this embrace spreads well beyond software, but into hardware and pretty much every arena in which there's a digital touch.
And can I follow up on that? Because Pierce O'Donoghue earlier mentioned the competitive compass, and part of that, in that they reference things like the strategic focus on things like robotics and space technology and things like that. And you've mentioned hardware, open source hardware. I mean, how do you feel that the balance in terms of the discussion around the potential for competitiveness in software versus hardware, open source software versus open source hardware, where is that at the moment? And is there, again, another opportunity there that Europe could compete on?
Yeah, I think you look at Infineon, you look at NXP, you look at a whole range of companies, ST. There is a foundational industry in the chip space. There's no reason to say that, oh, that's gone, TSMC is the only one who can do this or that. There's no reason why you can't plant a flag here to say we are going to be a leader in RISC-V, in being able to produce low volume runs at high yield and make money without having to rely on government subsidies to do so. And so there are the fundamental components of innovation are here. In fact, OAN's a great example. We've always had more participation, more licensee participation from companies in Europe than any other any other country around the world and region around the world. And so we've put a lot of emphasis on growing our community in China, but Europe is steadfastly 30 to 40% of our population. That evidences that small, medium-sized companies and the capacity to innovate is here. Education is here. People are well educated, the embrace of women. We need more women to participate as coders, to be part of this community. But that's a problem that exists everywhere in the world. We are, again, a global organization, but we recognize the differences between one country, one region, and another, and look at how we can, what open source is about is everybody lifting each other up. We all benefit when everyone's doing well, when everyone's participating, and by embracing the whole idea that collaborative development includes everyone. It's not the G10 or the G20 countries, it's everyone in the world having an opportunity to participate from where they live in the world, where they exist in the world, to be able to solve problems in software and in hardware.
Thank you. And I suppose thinking about that sort of trajectory and the investment that we might be able to put in there, and then coming back to your frustration earlier, Frank, in terms of speed, is there anything that the panel thinks that we could do to help these trajectories, both in terms of capitalizing on the opportunities that are there, but also in terms of engaging that diverse community that you're talking about? So we already seem to have a strong base of folks that are collaborating in Europe. We have a very strong open source community in Europe already. But what can we do to, I suppose, accelerate that, and not just increase it, but accelerate it in terms of the growth of that community and our ability to collaborate? Would anyone like to take that particular question?
Yeah, there are two things that come to mind. So first of all is really that we understand that it is possible. It seems a lot of times we are paralyzed here because we think, well, cloud just comes from the US, and like AI comes from the US, and collaboration software comes from, there's nothing we can do. And this is what I find interesting about DeepSeek, because it actually shows that with very little resources, you can actually do something, in this case from China, and I don't think the company or the model is particularly interesting. What I find interesting is that it is possible. Innovation is possible, and I think in Europe, we need to step up our game here and just innovate in this area too. We don't need to accept that we are just customers of some companies, big tech companies somewhere else. Now we can also be innovators there. But the second thing I want to mention is also the anti-competitive situation that we have here in Europe, because that's also, we from Nextcloud, we did an antitrust complaint against Microsoft lately, because there's some antitrust issues. For example, there's the bundling, right? I mean, the big tech companies do this very well. You're a customer of one product, for example, from Microsoft, and then you suddenly have Teams pre-installed, you have OneDrive pre-installed, and you have Copilot pre-installed, and it just, the consumers and the customers are pushed into this closed garden here, and this is a problem. This is the area where Europe needs to step up with regulations to break these anti-competitive behaviors.
Thank you, because we talked a lot about regulation earlier in the day, but perhaps more about like creating regulation and the newer ones, but actually, you know, some of the pre-existing regulation, I guess, are there that need to be looked at with the lens of where we are now in this open source, in this context, in terms of competitiveness for Europe. So thanks for bringing that up, Frank. And Sarah and both Philip were both going to come in. Philip, would you like to come in next? Because I know you were...
So taking this up, like how to enable this, and I think the DeepSeek is a good example with small effort. And like, I come from the automotive business, and we see that in, it was said this morning, Germany could become the next Detroit. It's a little bit, like I say, I don't know if I fully believe in it, but at least it's a good example or a good comparison to it. And I see that there is action going on because we see that market's changing, that we have new influence on the global parts, and automotive is trying to change this. And one example was like recently, the beginning of the year, end of last year, there was a letter of intent by Mercedes, Porsche, Bosch in Baden-Württemberg saying we want to get more, because the Baden-Württemberg area is very strong for automotive, that we want to create a FOSS land where small and middle-sized enterprise find their way into it. And by this, we need to foster more open source collaboration. And to see this is like really having CEOs of companies speaking about open source. It's a change, and for one, it may look still slow, and I feel it should go much faster. And we're both, like Sarah and I, we also see how many members we have and how much we could achieve, and if we just get also more resources and in these fields for the open source projects. But you see that OEMs come and ask for open source being part of their product offerings, and you're touching on the marketing part, and it's coming in because there are these initiatives, and there are people which do marketing in automotive and run to the different people, tell them what's possible, build demonstrators, showcases, and so on, which ends up then later on to ask for open source, because also there are not the direct hyperscalers, but there are like market dominating proprietary solutions, which OEMs also would like to overcome and create a competitiveness. And they see open source gives me open standards, interfaces where I can act on, and where I have a chance to change a solution and create a competitive among suppliers and give the room for new players.
And so is it related then to, like it's fantastic, like the Baden-Württemberg story in terms of those folks who are competitors essentially coming together to collaborate in this way and make a stance about being really explicit about the benefits of open source software, what it gives to them, what it gives to their ecosystem. But those narratives that they talk about there, like, are they clear enough for the broader, I suppose, ecosystem? Are they different narratives than we have discussed here today? What convinced the CEOs of that group of company to actually make that statement?
I assume it's also what you can figure out. We're a global environment, and you see what's happening in other places. And some parts where we are starting with prototyping in open source and then changing to commercial offerings over time to just get it based on the standards which we need to fulfill based on regulations. With the other areas where regulations are not that strong, where our checks are limited, and where you have more freedom of choice, or where you just are willing to take a higher risk or a higher liability on certain things. And by this is what the CEOs, and so they travel worldwide, they travel global. We are global companies. So they see how are markets affected, what are the competitors doing, and they see that these competitors are using open source in their products, and they also see we need to do something together. If we all do our own environments and our own things, it doesn't help us. And that's why now initiatives come up, like with the Eclipse SDV, where really competitors join, and then like we recently started an initiative on more safe open source middleware, where Mercedes and BMW start the initiatives, which are really two major OEMs, and they just said, okay, we don't see the value in there to do it on our own. We see a value in doing it together because we need to compete with the world, and we need to have an offering which is attractive to all, where it's not about my solution or your solution, it's about our stack, which we need to fulfill requirements, but also to just have something open and open for contribution.
Thank you. And I bring, yes, exactly. Sarah, come right in there now.
Yes, so to be honest, if I can be entirely transparent with you, I think it is the need that is putting people together. because honestly, if it was a word like a few years ago even, those organizations would have never pulled their efforts together, to be honest. I think it's just that margin is much lower. It's so extremely complex to develop software that runs in your car. There are so many regulations, and you don't find talent because, to be honest, mechanical engineers, they are not the best software developers ever. So although what Philip said is absolutely makes a lot of sense, what I think that finally is the final push that put them together is the absolute and total need of sharing the cost. And from an OEM perspective, of course, they want to be able to be flexible, so they don't want to be locked in their tiers. So they need to have a standardization because they want to buy a camera from a certain OEM, from a certain tier, buy the software that does the autonomous braking from another. They want to be able to change their chip without having to redesign everything from scratch. So that's what OEMs want. And on the other hand, what tiers want is to develop the same code for all of their OEMs so that the final customization only comes on top. And this in a framework where everything is becoming more complex, where there is a lot of bureaucracy everywhere, regulations are coming on board, but honestly the automotive world is used to regulation because safety relevant software is nothing new. So paradoxically for the automotive world is easy to step into this new regulation, this CRA and so on, because they already are used to it. And also, as we heard today, I think Markus Rechtel gave a really interesting insight in the fact that OEMs want and are very sensible to getting small SMEs on board, because there is a lot of untapped potential there. And the barrier to entry for a SME in the software domain, particularly with open source, is not so high. Because of course, if you're an SME and you need to build something, you need to have the hardware, that costs a lot of money. But you can step into the world of software, particularly using open source, with very, very little investment. So SMEs, particularly in Europe, for the economic structure that we have, where we don't have huge organizations like in the US, SMEs are fundamental and we need to find a way of getting them on board. And open source can be a step, can be a ladder for them to grow and be fast.
And I just want to kind of highlight something you said earlier, because for me, it actually is a change in, again, the narrative around this. Like, you know, I came into the open source ecosystem back in about 2018, and all I heard at that point in time, particularly from a competitiveness perspective, was how open source can save you money, makes you more efficient because, you know, you're not paying for the software. Like there was a lot of narrative around that. In fact, that narrative has been pushed, I think, for many years into the broader ecosystem. But what you said was that it's about sharing cost, not getting stuff for free. And I really like that because it acknowledges the fact that it isn't free. It's you need to invest in it, whether it be time or money, but you need to invest. But the value and the efficiency comes from sharing that cost and sharing that investment so that it's not any one person waste, or multiple people wasting duplicate investment, I guess, from part of that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, because for me that's a different message and it's a great one.
And maybe if I can just close this topic, maintenance. That was an important point. It is even more important in the automotive domain, where you have to maintain your software for 10, 15 years. So,
well, I think that's possibly opening a point, but because we can talk about the opportunities that exist around that. Because again, to your point earlier, like when people talk about competitiveness, they talk about innovation, new services, but actually there's a huge potential there in terms of the business opportunity around providing maintenance and sustaining things over time that I'm assuming there is a section of the market really appreciate, because they've had to do that. But then coming back then to your comments around small and medium enterprises, because we agree that it is important, and very important from a European perspective, to encourage that kind of participation in these larger communities. And I just want to kind of ask you, in terms of, it is acknowledged that open source can help level the playing field, allow small organizations to get ahead faster in terms of their technology stack. But when you were mentioning regulation, for me, when we start hearing about the regulations that are now coming into place, that everyone who creates software has to comply with, that feels like a barrier for small, medium enterprises, because they may not understand the regulation. You know, it's complex. The large organizations can figure it all out. Do you feel does that provide a barrier for the smaller companies now that maybe wasn't existing in the past? Or is the collaboration with the larger organizations who do have the resources to look at this, does that help? I'm just wondering about, when you think about those smaller businesses, how do they participate on that level playing field if they have to understand all this compliance stuff?
So I don't think that the problem, at least in the automotive domain, so I'm sure it is an issue outside of this, but in the automotive domain, SMEs that already work in developing software for automotives, again, they are bound to write a software with a certain quality, providing a certain list of artifacts, following a certain process. So they already know all of this. I think the true issue here is getting European funds, getting into projects. So we, as Eclipse Foundation, we are part of a couple of large consortia in the automotive. Basically, we are profiting from funding from the EU in a couple of very important projects, Federate and Halfor STV. But I know that SMEs just don't get into these consortia because they are not known. On one end, and then on the other hand, they have to deal with so much bureaucracy that it's just not economically feasible for them. And that's where being part of a community and engaging and partnering with bigger organizations really plays a crucial role. And they get to know, they get to network, they get to get in touch and to work together with larger partners when they are part of communities, such as the Eclipse STV working group. So, and we go back here to open source in building community truly has a role to speeding up and to getting SMEs on board so that they can access to the funds that they need.
So being part of consortia and these collaborative projects actually reduces the need for the bureaucracy for the small and medium enterprises who want to play in this space. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's what I believe. I mean, of course, there is bureaucracy for everything. There are funds. They are difficult to get. But if you can get on board this consortia, then it's of course much easier.
Okay, and so speaking about funds, and I'll come to you now, Frank, because you can answer this question or make it. Do you want to come in on that?
Maybe I can say something controversial here a bit, because like I'm an entrepreneur, and a lot of people in my situations always argue against like regulations and stuff like that, because I think it's just an overhead and it's bad for business. I actually have the opposite opinion. I think it's actually very important what the EU is doing. First of all, a lot of regulations, Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, these are regulations who make sure that we have a level playing field, that we actually are able to fairly compete with these big tech companies. So I'm really a big fan of that. And lots of other regulations are also like helping to make sure that we have a free and democratic society, for example, or that like the interests of consumers are protected. And these are all very important things for me personally, obviously, but also from a business side. Right? A business cannot really grow without like these rules around it. So I just wanted to make the controversial point that not like lots of other CEOs, I'm actually pro-regulation. Obviously useful ones, but I really like what the EU is doing.
No, well, thank you for that. And I suppose I wanted to follow up on this question of, you know, we need funding. And because there are often calls for funding and there are promises of funding in various different high-level documents. And I guess the devil is in the detail, right? It's like there's funding, but for what? And how will it be distributed? So I'm going to ask you now, each panelist, to actually think, were there a magical pot of funding in the sky? What advice would you give to those who are implementing the funding programs about how to get it to the right places in the right way and minimizing any of the friction along the way? Because I think the speed aspect of this that Frank called out earlier is of the essence. So knowing what you have known in your past lives about all funding programs that have happened in Europe and elsewhere, what advice would you give to those implementing the funding programs, not if there was a magical pot? So maybe Philip, would you like to start?
First of all, see, the application process of funding is already something which is not easy. like it's a long multi-step. We saw the presentation from Mercedes-Benz, so this was a good point. I thought I directly took a copy of the slide, so like, okay, I'll use it further for sharing it with others, because it's a lot of effort in there, and also a lot of small enterprises may not be aware of it, that there is this kind of funding. And then what I could see is from this funding, maybe there can also be a chance to say, well, we have like projects where there need to be a certain amount of smaller companies involved directly. So you say, okay, it's bound on that there's a good mixture of industries, because this can enable regulations. It could be that you say a certain percentage of the outcome has to be, because there are also funds which are just free for everything. And the reporting then, when you are in the project, is also heavy effort. I don't know how many mails I just got for one of the project where I said, oh, we have our quarterly report, and then prepare, let's make a prep meeting, we need to do this, that. It's just like, it's 30 partners in this project, and you see how much effort is just taking to generate a report, which totally makes sense to have reports, right? The money should go somewhere, you need to know what happens with the money, but maybe spending half of the money to generate reports is not the right spending of the money. So even for smaller parts, I don't know if it's anything you could take, but you can also see like there's microcredits, which is like a thing where you can just give like I give you something, you don't get any on top, you have to pay it back, but it's just a small amount of money to just kick you off on certain technology. And this could be maybe a way of having micro funds for small enterprise to just bring them into a starting phase and just paying part of it back.
No, thank you. I'm just laughing at this notion that you get a fund or a project grant, and then you spend half your time paying to get it, and then you spend the rest of the fund paying to report about it. But so really love those kinds of comments in terms of trying to make that more efficient. Frank, would you like to comment?
Okay, maybe it's again me with a controversial statement. So I guess it's good that these funding projects exist, but we from the Nextcloud side, we are not participating in it at all. We are the main European competitor to Microsoft 365. That's what we're building. And I don't think we are getting there with funding projects. I mean, that's like taxpayers' money. I mean, I take it, sure, but that's not really the solution, right? What we're building, what we need is building a market where like companies can grow and get customers, sell to their customers, has a business model and products that are competitive. And this is what we are building at Nextcloud, and I think this is what's needed to become the real alternatives in Europe that we need. Funding projects can be nice, but I've seen personally so many cases where this was a distraction. There are so many small companies that I know that are totally rely on this project, and they don't have the time anymore to build their actual business. So this is a bit like, again, I'm a bit skeptical about that.
So let's build on that idea. So in the context, what I hear you saying is that if there was funding, it can't just be on building the technology. It has to kind of be focused on the pathway to get to the end user or the consumers. So, but can you elaborate on that then? Because that's I think that's a really interesting point, because an awful lot of the discussion is around fueling the folks who are building the innovation, but not necessarily those supporting the success in the long term, whether it be through maintenance from a technical perspective, or whether it be through this kind of business development side of things, if we're talking about commercial entities in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, the difference is also what you're exactly building. If you're doing like research, you're building you're researching some future technologies, and this is completely clear that there is no business model around it, then maybe this funding is fine. But if you're actually like companies who actually want to compete with big tech, then you really have to be careful to not have a distraction there. And I think open source definitely can be a competitive advantage that we have here. I mean, I also want to stress how well this fits to Europe, because Europe is very diverse. Europe is not centralized. We have lots of different regions, lots of different countries, languages, everything. We are not centralized. There is no European Silicon Valley or something. So the goal, what we in Europe should do, is to find a way where we all can collaborate together. So, and also there are a lot of SMEs here, right? And we don't have these gigantic companies in that way. And open source is, of course, the best model to collaborate across borders, across organizations. And I think building on that and building like real sustainable open source business models, this is actually what's needed. Again, funding can be very nice, but that's just that's not, it cannot be a distraction.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, would you spend the funding? Would you take it?
I would, of course. So I would have not one, but two suggestions. And actually the second goes really along the line of what you were saying. So the first suggestion is don't go and create yet another consortia, right? So consortia and initiatives are key, but there already are quite a certain number. So if there is something that you, as EU, you see is working well, don't go and create yet another. Just expand and fund and allocate and market the consortium that's already there first.
Well, and I'm going to take the corollary of that, which would be, you know, I suppose if you're amplifying what works, should you dampen and kill what doesn't?
Well, it goes along the same lines as open source projects, right? So you don't select your favorite open source project, you kind of have a natural selection by adoption. So that was my first suggestion. And second suggestion is make sure it's not yet another research project. Research projects are great. So I worked in university, I loved research project, but we need to make sure that the project that maybe is developed initially based on some funding, even by research departments, it becomes a product. So that there is this jump in quality, there is this jump in regulation, there is this jump in artifacts that make it become from one research project a product. It's not going to be a one-to-one ratio. You're going to need 10 research projects to make one product, but you need to have this line so that you can justify investing money in research to make sure that at least some of it becomes a product.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. Keith?
I don't think a lot about funding when I think about the success of open source and the success of innovation through projects, because you really reduce it to first principles. Projects are the key. We bring people together, we support collaboration, and we provide an example. And I think we have a bit of a crisis in that we're expanding at such a rate that we don't have enough professional project management activity where we can bring enough people to bear who really understand how to provide guidance, how to provide training. And I think it's great that the Eclipse Foundation has come to Europe, and I think it's great that the LF is doing more than putting a toe in the water in Europe to be able to expand the platform here and the footprint. I think, you know, if we look at what Open Atom's doing, Open Atom 6 years ago had 6 projects. It started with 6 projects, it now has 57 projects. And that's just in one country, obviously a very big country, but Open Atom recognizes that professional management of projects is critical to the success of those projects. The LF has done a whole series of analysis of what makes a successful project, what are the factors that you need to have, and one of them is just more professional, talented general managers to be able to run these projects and more foot soldiers to be able to administrate the projects inside and be able to create the liaison with the individuals who are actually coming from different companies and recruiting from small, medium-sized companies, large companies. Smart people are everywhere. We want to bring as many smart people into these projects as possible. So I would say that the trending in the last 3 years with the move of professional project management organizations to Europe is going to be a critical component of success, an accelerant. Because you can also, you look at the Japanese. Japanese are very unique in that they have been supporting collaborative development for a good 35 years with essentially the open compute, the compute projects they supported 1 through 6 allowed for them to kind of draw on the fact that this is a culture that is very unique and that it is very homogeneous, but it's also, within that homogeneity is a certain diversity. And they're getting the best out of people, and they prepared for, it's almost as if they knew where the world was going, because no one prepared better their population for open source than the Japanese through those kinds of collaborative programs and through all manner of government-encouraged collaboration activities. And so we have a very unique culture there that's allowed. You look at 7 years ago, Toyota decided that they didn't want to be a metal bending company, which is what they were in danger of becoming, and they got together with the LF and they founded and basically were an advocate for automotive-grade Linux. Automotive-grade Linux has grown up spectacularly in terms of what it focuses on and what it's delivering. And it's not only attracted all the Japanese companies, it's attracted Korean companies, Chinese companies, and most of the European companies to be able to be an important complement now by what's being done at the projects that Bosch and others are advocating for, that Eclipse is managing here. I think project management organizations are a critical resource. And when I see them coming here, I'm encouraged, and I think that's more important than funding, because talent, understanding, culturation, and socialization about how we participate in innovation through projects is really what's missing, and that's why having that expertise here is very important.
Could we apply the funding to building the talent?
Sure.
Okay, right.
Because we need more talent. We
Okay.
do.
Okay,
There are just too many projects and too few talented general managers that are working in open source.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Thank you, Keith. Philip.
Yeah, I would like to add one point, which is not directly related to the funding, but also with the collaborative approach. What we like a lot in the open source is the community, right? To interact with people, to talk to them, to exchange ideas and every part of it, and to enable others. So if there's a newcomer in a community, try to give them a little bit of welcome package, and you see that successful projects come with a lot of documentation. And we were talking about small, middle-sized enterprises. And last year I attended a meeting of the Open Chain Automotive work group. And in the preps of it, we explicitly asked, or I was like, what small and middle-sized enterprises do you know? How do we get them on board? And with these projects, we once provide them documentation, we give them entry points, and we're really actively seeking for what is there. And it's actually not easy to just find, like, you can Google like small automotive company. It's not, you don't get the bad hits, right? It's really hard, and it doesn't matter which search engine you use, it will always come with the same results. So you need to use local networks, figure out like what is there, and then bring these people also in, because by this way you can create networks, and it's much easier to promote your solution and to explain what you can deliver than, like, I don't know if you have ever tried to go to a fair and then you go to the fair, so you go to your favorite company, you want to sell a solution. That's not the right people, because the people standing at the fair are the ones selling. It's not the ones they are buying. And you need to like go to the place where can you find people buying then. And therefore it's nice to more go into this environment and have initiatives like the foundations around with Open Chain. Also AGL can be a room. And you see always here and there are smaller sized companies which can just get in there and get a feed into it, promote themselves in a project, and then make business out of it. I don't know if it's automotive specific, that's my area, but that's at least... I don't
think so. I think the social network effect in business is much underrated when it comes to competitiveness. And I suppose that's one of the, again, values that you can get out of open source, because it is by nature a social, collaborative network in terms of folks, people being connected as much as technology. So thank you for that. We have very few minutes left, so I'm going to ask each one of our panelists just to maybe do one closing remark. If you had a magic wand, if you were kind of saying there'd be one thing that I think should change in Europe to make it more competitive, maybe apart from the funding, what would it be? I'm going to ask, maybe Keith, I'll get you to start. We'll go down the line.
I think if government can recognize that there are lots of examples of successful development programs that have yielded innovation, great technologies that are in significant use by, this is perhaps too American a term, but government getting out of the way and recognizing the difference between enablement and constriction. We want to enable, we want to think about the ramifications of any policy that we put in place to ensure that we are enabling collaboration, enabling opportunities for people to come together to be able to create solutions that they couldn't create on their own at the price point that you can, and in the time frame.
Thank you, Keith. Sarah?
Well, I might have slightly changed my opinion. So I think that finally what we need to focus in Europe is diversity. So we need to focus on diversity because we have such a heterogeneous set of countries that are coming together, so many backgrounds, and we need to find a way to make this into a resource. be it through training, be it through consortia, be it through SMEs. And I think this is what we need to leverage.
Thank you. Gather together the strength of the diverse community. Love that. Thank you. Frank?
I really think that we are on a crossroads here. We have so many huge challenges now from China, from Russia, from Trump. We really need to step up our game here. So this is really something where we need to get ready for these challenges. Otherwise, we really have serious problems with our society, with our democracy, and also from our business perspective. And I think open source is the tool for that. This is really the tool to innovate and to bring us the digital sovereignty, so we need to step up our game. And of course, the question, what can be done? I actually think it's not hard at all. If for example, European governments would say, okay, we identified certain critical infrastructure, and this infrastructure in the future, we buy only solutions that are open source. There will be a boom of companies, of products, of innovation in Europe here to provide exactly that, where this demand is then be. And this will just, stimulate this ecosystem a lot, and I think then we are hopefully in a better position than today.
Thank you, Frank. Philip?
I would like to take it not on the competitive side and not basically on what we have said, but I just look in my surrounding, and we were talking about public, and a lot of friends and other people which just come, they are not aware about open source. Many have never heard about it. And like I'm the techie guy around, and they come now and they heard in the news or read it somewhere that their Windows 10 supports end in October. And now they say like, what should I do? Do I need to buy a new computer, laptop, whatever? How do I handle this? And this goes down there and into school, and there's even a fully missing understanding about what open source means. So I was going into voluntary people which are working in the church, and they were literally asking, there are people building open source software, which means free software, they're doing it without money. Are you kidding me? Just for the good of others, where the people who are working in a church as volunteers should understand it better than others, that it's voluntary work where you, with passion, working on a topic. They couldn't just imagine it for software. And we need to spread this into the kids, into schools, into the public awareness that we need open source and that it's an option. Your choice.
That. Thank you, Philip. And I want to kind of build on that to say, if I was adding my wish on that, being able to do that education, but also being able to show what good looks like. I mean, even over these last night with the European Open Source Awards, with all the discussion here today, so much I didn't know about, and I consider myself part of this community. And the stories from Europe, the stories from the people in Europe doing amazing work, I just don't think they're broadly enough known. And so my one would be to actually amplify more of what is good within Europe, because there's lots there that we can build upon, that we can copy, that we can amplify and accelerate, but it's just a matter of raising that up. So with that, I just want to say a huge thank you to my fabulous panelists. So thank you, Philip, thank you, Frank, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Keith, and thank you all for listening. Hope you enjoyed that show. Thanks.